It's great to see you all here today. And Phil did mention, and I just want to thank both Phil and Jake for setting up this panel for us today. Phil mentioned that they entitled this Everybody's Favorite Policy Panel. I don't know if that's true for everyone in the crowd, but it is certainly true for me, and that's for two reasons. The first one is I get to sit on a panel and moderate a panel with these enormously talented policy experts and some lawyers. And we have had sort of an ongoing conversation about these issues for the last few years, both at the last ETH Boston and the one before that and the last Solana conference. So it's exciting to get back together again. But really it's because of the crowd. This is one of the few events that policy people get to talk to builders and founders, people out there in the trenches who are actually trying to make things and find product market fit and create something delightful for people. So we're not just talking to fellow lawyers, we're talking to you, and that's what makes it at least my favorite policy panel. And what a great crowd we have up here on stage. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves in one moment, but just to set the stage, if you had been in the crowd at any one of those events that I had mentioned before, you would have been hearing us talking about, should American builders go overseas? When is Congress going to act? Will they ever act? You know, what can we do to bring down not just the risk of regulatory investigations, but of prosecution in some cases? This is the first time that you will see this group up on stage smiling. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why. Now, three of the four of us are lawyers, so we're not going to be like unreservedly joyous. There are still things that we're worried about, and we're going to talk about that too. But let me let this enormously talented panel introduce themselves, starting with Mari.
Hey, my name is Mari Tomunen. I'm General Counsel at DoubleZero, which is building a private version of the internet that is faster if validators want to validate blocks faster. I also teach blockchain and crypto law at Boston College Law School, training future lawyers.
Hi everyone, it's great to be with you. My name is Mark Cianci, partner at Israel David LLC and board member and secretary at the Boston Blockchain Association. I focus on high-stakes commercial litigation, cryptocurrency-related litigation, and strategic counseling and advice for blockchain-related companies and investors.
Hi everyone, Chris Lehman, co-founder and head of policy and research at Groma. Groma's building a real estate-backed token. We've got a lot of exciting stuff going on this year, but core proposition is real estate coin, stablecoin for real estate.
Thanks, everybody. And I'm Gus Coldebella. I was, many years ago, the general counsel of Homeland Security in the Bush administration. I then took a weird turn into crypto, where I worked with a lot of the people in the crowd when I was the chief legal officer at Circle. I was in the general counsel of Paradigm. And now I'm a partner at a venture capital fund, very early stage venture capital fund based in Palo Alto, California, called True Ventures. And what I like to do, and what everybody on stage likes to do, is help founders figure out the thorniest legal and regulatory issues, and there's no better place to do that than in crypto. Let's start with, we had talked about talking about the law, and we're going to do that in a minute, but I want to talk about a vibe check first. What is everybody feeling after the first 6 months of an administration that seems, and I think objectively is, much more receptive to crypto? What is exciting to you, Marty?
Well, I can start. What has excited me for the last 10 minutes is that crypto has really hit retail. Jake's mom is here in this audience, which means that something has pierced a veil. What is really exciting about the new administration is that we have a different shift, not only in prosecution and enforcement, but in the way we approach this industry. We want to see it succeed. When we talk to regulators, they're trying to find ways to help developers move forward and launch instead of being quiet or trying to find mistakes or vulnerabilities in their strategy. And I think we'll go into the details of what has been passed later, but that's what gets excited me, the mind shift in the eyes of regulators.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I largely agree. And a good example of the mentality within the current administration that's seeking to come alongside and collaborate with the industry is the Securities and Exchange Commission's crypto task force and some of the guidance that has emanated from that task force. And it's not being created in a vacuum. We'll probably get into more detail later, but the crypto task force is out there meeting with industry regularly. I had the pleasure of meeting with them a few months ago over an informal dinner, and that's just emblematic of the mindset shift that less than a year has brought forward.
Yeah, 100% agreed. Under the previous administration, the SEC was seen internally by Groma as a big risk. And, we worked with them and we had productive conversations, but it was constantly dancing on eggshells and being maximally conservative. But now it's very different, right? There's a mutual recognition that there are a lot of genuine theoretical questions for which the answers are not obvious to the world broadly. And the SEC seems genuinely interested both academically and as a matter of doing what's best for investors, for innovators, et cetera, in figuring out what the best answers to those questions are. And it's very exciting to be on the ground floor and trying to figure out what frameworks and what regulations, legislation, et cetera, are going to be the correct ways to resolve those questions.
Excellent. Why don't we start right there? I mean, I think the way that we think about the players in the U.S. government are, obviously things get resolved in the courts, but we have the administration, the executive branch, and we have Congress, the legislative branch. And previously, we had a Congress that wasn't doing anything and an executive branch that was really actively against, at least as instantiated by the SEC, crypto moving forward, being able to register, do the things that it needed to do to effectively carry on business and innovate in the United States. Over the past few months, we've had a signing ceremony in the White House for the first crypto bill that was passed by the U.S. Congress. Mari, will you take us through the Genius Act and what it means?
The Genius Act, so stablecoins. Even during the prior administration, stablecoins have always been legal. It has been possible to issue stablecoins, as some people at Circle know. But it was very complicated and cumbersome to have a license. It's maybe go through each state. Do I need a money transmission license here? And now what the Genius Act does is that you can have one single federal regulator that will give you license to issue stablecoins in the US or at the state level. But it will give you the license holders a clear framework. What do you have to do monthly at the stations? Of course, 100% backed by whatever the reserve asset is. But it actually means more than that. So that's the technical part of lawyers advising how do you issue stablecoins. It's now easier. But the significance to the entire industry is actually larger than that. Now, also other financial institutions, think like major banks, can look at crypto industry and see this as like a stamp of approval from the highest level of our government. Crypto is no longer anymore only for money laundering or drugs, but it's actually something that is regulated, and you can build businesses and business models on top of stable coins. So this is just a start for other innovation to build on top of stable coins and crypto. And there will be another act, right?
No, we'll talk about
Absolutely, yeah.
Anything to add on Genius?
For me, I think the big impact to the industry is the ability for new entrants to get into the stablecoin market. And that's startups, but it's also legacy players like Walmart and Amazon and other large retailers that previously may have not had a clear path forward for developing a proprietary stablecoin for users within those retail environments. And now that path is clearly available. So I think we'll see something of a massive proliferation of an abundance of different stablecoins over the next couple years in the United States. And then, as in many of these scenarios, some amount of consolidation and constriction as either the user base or other factors cause some of them to fall by the wayside, but the end result will be an appropriate, diversified menu of stablecoins that can be used at all levels of industry.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. So Tether today announced that they're going to launch another stablecoin. Why do we need more than one stablecoin?
Well, I guess I set that up. So the part of the reason it excites me is it allows for users who want to optimize their power, their purchasing power, their spending power within a particularized environment to do so. So maybe if you're using, let's just stick with the Walmart example. I love Walmart. If you have a Walmart stablecoin, maybe there are discounts or premium values or other incentives associated with your purchasing power at Walmart that you want to use within that environment. And you're not as big a fan as Target, and so you're not going to invest your fiat into the Target stablecoin. So I think it's a function of customization primarily.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Oh yeah, and just one last top level point there. Money should be competitive, right? There are all kinds of reasons why someone might choose one credit card over another credit card. The same thing should happen with currency, right? We have the dollar today, which is extremely standardized, but having stable coins that provide the ability for, as you said, optimization around the edges is great for anybody who cares about the utility of currency.
The two quick takeaways for me, one in response to Marty's question, is this is how the US market should work, which is we're allowing innovators to innovate and to figure out the elements of the product that is, in this case, stablecoins that they're bringing to market that will hopefully delight consumers, but some, as Mark said, will fall by the wayside. We're going to figure out what is necessary using a market approach rather than a top-down regulatory approach, with the exception of the essential consumer protection elements of Genius, which are about what kinds of securities and other instruments are to back the stable coin. So that's the first thing. And the second quick thing is, Mari mentioned banks, and as did Mark, getting into this. And we have gone in the span of a year to 18 months from banks debanking people who interacted with crypto to banks now struggling to be stablecoin issuers. And there are a lot of dynamics at play there, but I think it's just worth noting that we have now a 10-year-old saying, maybe longer than that, in crypto, that we're still early, but that shows that we're still very, very early.
One last thing to add on Genius. So I think if we're looking back at the biggest debacle in stablecoin history, it was the Terra Luna fiasco. And Genius very helpfully prevents that from ever happening again, at least exactly that from ever happening again, because it requires full backing of stablecoins and prevents the rolling out of algorithmic stablecoins that aren't fully backed.
So the two main pieces of legislation that were moving through Congress sort of simultaneously were Genius, which we've talked about, and a market structure bill. It was first known in the House as Fit 21, and the House did pass Fit 21. And then the next Congress came in and tweaked it, made it better, passed it as something called the Clarity Act. Now, the Senate is considering its version of the market structure bill. And Chris, why don't you take us through what's in it, what a market structure bill is, and when we might see something out of that process.
Yeah, great question. So two market structure bills, right? Clarity under the House, which has passed the House, and the RFIA for the Senate, which is still in a draft state, right? It's not even formally under consideration for voting yet. Democrats have some notes on broad principles. Republicans have issued a draft. I think it's probably useful to start first off, what was in the Clarity Act and what is different in the RFIA. Clarity Act was, I guess, core understanding of what a market structure bill is. It's delineating authority for regulating digital assets between the SEC and the CFTC and creating criteria that enable people to confidently determine for a given digital asset token what it's going to be considered. Will it be considered a digital asset security? Will it be considered a digital commodity or a stablecoin in the case of the Genius Act? The Clarity Act focused heavily on decentralization as the criterion for determining whether something's a commodity or a security. The more centralized the ownership and control and rule-making of a given token is, the more likely it is to be considered a security, right? So if you have, say, I think it's over 20% of it controlled by a single team, if you have significant discretion over who's allowed to participate and at what stage, these are all things that push it under the House's bill to be more of a security. There's a bit of a grace period early on as these tokens are necessarily going to be fairly centralized at the beginning, but after that grace period has expired, if you're not sufficiently decentralized, you're likely to be issuing a security. Otherwise, you can be considered a commodity, right? Once you've hit that level of decentralization, commodity is the label. And notably, the Clarity Act doesn't focus as much on the economics of the tokens, right? So the fact that a token might produce yield or might have explicit financial elements to it, because those explicit financial elements, expectation of profit, are not under the control of a centralized operation, they don't trigger the Howey test. They aren't putting themselves into categorization as securities. Contrast this with the Senate bill, Senate draft bill, RFIA, which does not focus on decentralization and instead focuses on economics. So RFIA will consider you a security if you are paying out dividends or if there's an explicit ownership stake, explicit financialization. It's less concerned about whether the value of the token is a property of network effects and is more looking at the explicit economic promises associated with the token, and decentralization doesn't enter into it as much. Now, that could change, right? Regardless of what ends up happening with RFIA, whatever the Senate does will have to be reconciled with what the House has already passed, and we'll see what that looks like. And so that brings me to the timeline, as Gus mentioned. There are two relevant committees here. There's the Senate Banking Committee, which governs the SEC and securities regulation, and there's the Senate Agricultural Committee, which has jurisdiction over commodities. And they each have their own separate versions. It's predicted loosely, but maybe not reliably, that ideally the Banking Committee will have finished its debate on its draft by the end of September. I think they were looking at agriculture by end of October, reconciliation in November, and then potentially to the president's desk by December. Now, these are, I believe that it was mostly the timeline that Senator Lummis outlined, and so that may be somewhat optimistic. There were some predictions made about the timeline back in Q2 that ended up being overly optimistic. So we'll see. There's no guarantee that we will get any market structure bill passed into law in 2025, and then the question of whether we get anything in 2026 is really uncertain, right? Congress has limited time. They've spent a lot of time this year on the Genius Act earlier on the market structure bills now, and it's possible that they'll have other things on their plate next year. But the good news there is, even if Congress doesn't create legislative clarity on market structure, the SEC has very clearly signaled that it's going to be engaging in rulemaking, right? Ideally, the rulemaking will happen with guidance from Congress, but if there's no such guidance, the SEC has lots of ideas already about what that rulemaking is going to entail, and fortunately, again, bringing in a lot of people from the industry to provide comment and collaboration on that rulemaking process, which will unfold over the course of several months.
And interestingly, the chairman of the SEC said 2 weeks ago that decentralization is no longer part of the legal test that they use when they look at tokens. He also said that most tokens are not securities. So someone could ask, do we need the Congress to pass anything? Since the SEC is actively speaking publicly, tokens are not securities, decentralization is not part of the test. So even if it's not passed, I'm optimistic that there will be clear ways for token issuers to operate and launch in the US under the current SEC's leadership.
I think the key phrase is what you ended with, the current SEC's leadership. And so I think that possibility that in a few more years we could have a different administration which brings in a different SEC, and we have this seesaw effect going back and forth between potentially unfavorability towards the industry, then favorability, and then again unfavorability. I think that dynamic underscores why there really is some urgency around passing either clarity or the Senate version of that bill, because in the absence of something that's locked in at a congressional level, the SEC guidance, whether it be formal or informal, can be fairly easily rolled back by a new administration, should that be their desire. So I don't think we're out of the woods, we're in a good zone, but there's further work to be done, for sure.
Yeah, I think the point that each of you made is important to underscore, which is the SEC could have always created a line through regulation or guidance or otherwise that said, okay, this type of crypto token is something that we're not going to regulate as a security, or if you do these things that are a lighter touch sort of regulation, you'll be within our regulatory sandbox. Commissioner Hester Peirce, who has been on the SEC for quite some time and was a staffer to the current chairman, Paul Atkins, when he was a commissioner on the SEC, so she's been around the block a heck of a lot, has for years now had sandbox and other regulatory proposals that would allow innovators to innovate without running afoul of the securities laws. But as everyone in this room and everyone in the industry who has been paying attention knows, that was not the approach, as Mark said, of the last administration and the SEC chairman in the last administration, Gary Gensler. Instead, the idea was we are going to, this is the SEC, use essentially all of our enforcement powers and our regulatory powers to try to stop the crypto industry from taking root in the United States. And that has that did result in a lot of regulatory distortions that I hope we have a chance to talk about in a few minutes. But I would like to spend a celebratory few minutes with Mari and everyone talking about what we're seeing out of this SEC. Pre-Atkins, post-Atkins, with the crypto task force and the various other initiatives that they're following.
Yeah, so pre-Atkins, we saw from the news, the SEC suing Coinbase, now Binance, now the next token issuer. And with this SEC, they started in January saying meme coins, not securities. Stable coins, not securities. Proof of work activities, securities laws, not there. SEC, not there. Proof of stake, not securities. Liquid staking, staking pools, delegated staking, all outside the SEC's jurisdiction. OCC saying banks can custody crypto. What else the SEC says recently? I think the liquid staking one was the latest. I think the big framework for what is inside the SEC's jurisdiction when it comes to crypto, what fundraising activities with respect to token sales are regulated by the SEC, that is still unknown. We don't know yet. So that is hopefully coming by the end of the year. I hope the SEC doesn't wait until Congress decides whether or not they're going to pass, but the SEC should take steps to. Now they have gone around the country meeting people like Mark, and now it's time for them to start issuing no action letters and affirmative guidance of how to move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that this isn't the SEC working on its own, though the SEC could work on its own. There's also a report that the White House convened essentially all of the regulators who have any part in touching crypto and gave them, 3 months to come up with a America Leading in Digital Assets report. And that report is worth a read. It's not long, but it lays out a really nice blueprint, including what the SEC is doing, but beyond what the SEC is doing, for how this administration is trying to supercharge crypto in the United States.
Yeah, and just jumping off that, another differentiator between this time this year and this time last year is we are seeing a greater degree of interagency coordination. I remember last year, especially between the CFTC and the SEC, you would have almost these rap battles of letters going back and forth between the commissioners and the other personnel within those two respective agencies, where they were taking issue with each other's approaches. And we're seeing quite the opposite this year. Just in the last week or so, the SEC and the CFTC have on 2 occasions issued joint reports, joint recommendations, and part of the messaging is we're going to work on this together. There's also details in terms of what the specific initiatives are, but the headline point is we want to work on this together so that the industry isn't faced with uncertainty and misdirection coming from 2 different portions within the government.
Yeah, and from our perspective, as we have a token ourselves that is unquestionably a security, right? Groma coin is a REIT share on chain. REIT shares are securities. Tokenized REIT shares are therefore securities. There's never been any uncertainty around that, and that's something we were very forthright about with the Gensler SEC and are continuing to be forthright about with the Atkins SEC. But where there is some ambiguity and where we've found the conversation to be very fruitful is around the question of, okay, securities are one thing. What constitutes a securities exchange? And that's another question that I think there's been less discourse about, at least for the general public, though obviously there are many entities that are very concerned with that question. But, to the degree that people are trading in securities and maybe trading in securities on chain, maybe even doing so in a decentralized context, which trip lines are the relevant ones for causing that kind of system to become a securities exchange as opposed to just an exchange that happens to involve securities? There's a lot of really interesting unresolved questions that were at the center of the dispute between Uniswap and the SEC that started in 2024 under Gensler and was ended almost immediately after the new chair Atkins came in February of this year. But even though the enforcement was over, those questions are still open. What status does KYC AML impart upon an exchange? Is that controlling access in a way that causes it to be a securities exchange because somebody's setting rules? What kind of fees can either a protocol charge or can a pool creator charge? What does it mean to bring together buyers and sellers of securities, which is one of the core tests? Is a liquidity provider having, effectively a standing limit order, or is it something else entirely? And what do liquidity ranges mean for that? I don't know the answers to those questions. I can say, the polarity of different things and, whether they move it farther or closer to being a securities exchange. But the fact that the SEC genuinely seems eager to figure out the answers to those questions in a way that is not a gotcha and that provides as much value as possible while maintaining protections for people is very encouraging.
Chris, I'm glad you raised all of those points because two takeaways for me. One is it is not the end of crypto policy history. There's still a lot to work on. We're doing so in a much more favorable environment, but there are a lot of unanswered questions. And the second thing is if you heard the chairman's initial speech on crypto, I went from thinking that maybe we were, as an industry, asking for too much to thinking that we were asking for too little. Paul Atkins gave the speech and he said, all markets should be on-chain. That's going from, hey, we're crypto builders. We want to be safe in building in the United States. We want to make sure that we're able to self-custody and do the sort of the list of things that we think are important to do. And the new chairman of the SEC is saying, hey, we like what you built. I want to use it for everything. And therefore, it's very important for us as a community with our regulators to be focused on the questions that you just raised and others. Mari mentioned a lot of the lawsuits from the pre-Atkins days. And Mark, I know that all eyes were on the Roman Storm prosecution in the Southern District of New York. I'm sure a lot of people everyone on stage and a lot of people in the crowd are still concerned about how builders are going to be treated under the criminal laws of the United States. Are they money transmitters? Is there potential liability like we saw for Tornado Cash? And beyond that, what's the enforcement outlook for the next 2, 3, 6 months?
So starting with Tornado Cash, there's a disparity in terms of how the organization, the entity, was treated and how the developer was treated. So, and the entity really just being the programmable, immutable code. So back in 2024, month of November, the Federal Appellate Court concluded that the OFAC list had impermissibly restricted Tornado Cash and considered Tornado Cash a sanctioned entity or a sanctioned program. The Federal Appellate Court said there's no basis to do that, and the Tornado Cash program was, again, whitelisted on the OFAC list. So it was permissible to interact with, and there was no liability for interacting with the program. So you would think, all right, we now have, as a matter of civil liability, a federal appellate court saying no harm, no foul. You would think that, given that precedent, the criminal enforcers would say, okay, well then the person that created the program isn't liable for anything because the program itself is non-problematic. And again, we've seen all these other indicators that the administration wants to be less scrutinizing and less harsh towards the industry. Well, as we all know, that didn't happen in the case of the criminal prosecution of Roman Storm. The DOJ, under the new administration, continued the prosecution all the way to a trial that culminated last month. And although Mr. Storm was acquitted on the money laundering charges and the sanctions avoidance charges, he was convicted on the supposedly, apparently criminal charge of conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money services business. And so he's awaiting his sentencing. He will most certainly appeal, and he is in the meantime not incarcerated, but he still has this significant overhang of a criminal conviction and a pending criminal sentence. And I think it's a wake-up call to the industry more broadly that part of this disconnect within the government that I just talked about was a significant factor under the prior administration. We're still living with some of that under the new administration. And maybe there was some deference to the prior criminal authorities that had instituted the charge, and so the administration just said, we're going to keep going with this. We haven't seen a number of parallel cases being brought by the new administration as opposed to being closed out from the prior administration, but it's still a significant overhang. And it also highlights that the criminal authorities are not the only source of liability for developers. Private litigators, private parties can bring suit against developers on a whole range of issues. And none of those litigators and none of those parties are dropping their initiative to sue large and small participants in the industry just because the government's view may have shifted. So private litigation against the industry remains a significant concern.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And one of the things about the Storm prosecution that I think got under the skin of a lot of people who think about these things is that for years, the FinCEN office at the Department of Treasury in the federal government, the Financial Crimes Unit of Treasury, said, hey, you know what? Unless you're custodying funds, you are not a money services business. The DOJ in the Roman Storm prosecution took a totally different tack and said, we understand you're not custodying funds, but we're going to prosecute you under this law called Section 1960 that says you should have registered as a money services business. And that's exactly the one charge out of the ones that Mark described that he was found guilty of. It's probably good for him for an appeal, honestly, and it really shines a light on a lot of the work that our industry groups are doing with Congress. One of the bills that we talked about before, I think it's the Senate version of the market structure bill, at least in the last draft that I saw, had a provision that would clarify that Section 1960, which is what he was prosecuted under, should not be used against people who are designing and issuing software on-chain. Let's talk about the open questions. We talked, Chris, you talked about a few earlier about what's a securities exchange, but there are a heck of a lot of open questions that I think we could be working with this administration to resolve, and that builders are very interested in. So I'll open it up to the whole group. What are you thinking are the things that are still causing some apprehension amongst folks who are building in crypto, and how should we prioritize them to solve those problems?
Yeah, so I guess one that's become salient again in the past week or two is the issue of stablecoin yield. So the Genius Act, the stablecoin bill from July, prohibited stablecoin yield, but the industry is trying to take the position that there are lots of ways to reward holders of stablecoins that don't constitute yield, right? Financial rewards could be considered a marketing expense, for instance. And so that is something that is an open question, and that the banking lobby, notably, is trying to insert additional clarity into the Senate version of the market structure bill to make it a more broad and less evadable prohibition on all kinds of monetary compensation for stablecoin holders. So that's one that is definitely going to be contentious as we see that bill move forward through committees.
As I think about what's still open, obviously we've talked about the fact that we still don't have a market structure bill, and although the SEC has come down with its perspective on what constitutes a security and what doesn't, one thing that the elimination or the failure to continue many of the cases that the SEC had brought against many of the businesses in the industry, one factor that's generated by that development is now courts are not going to weigh in and fill that void that continues to exist within the governance structure around what is a security, what is not a security in the crypto space. And we had seen some courts start to address that question, and actually a number of courts had gotten it fairly right on that question. But with the elimination or the non-persistence of many of the cases that the SEC had brought, which is, of course, overall a good thing. One negative byproduct of that is we're not seeing those courts then further shape the landscape in terms of what's a security and what isn't. And so again, that question, until Congress answers it, is now going to be answered by courts, but courts hearing arguments from private litigants as opposed to hearing arguments from government positions. So it's going to continue to maintain a level of uncertainty and a level of confusion unless and until the Clarity Act or another market structure bill goes through.
So one thing that excites me and one that worries, exciting are the super apps that Chair Atkins talks about. So a platform where you can trade both tokens that are not securities, tokens and equity. So think like NASDAQ marrying with Coinbase, or actually NASDAQ just invested in Gemini, so maybe I should say them getting married. The other thing one thing that worries me is, let's say crypto is not regulated by the SEC. It's a commodity now under CFTC jurisdiction, much smaller agency, less funds, less people, and there's still this problem of market manipulation and insider trading. Do we have, or do they have what they need to fix that or protect token holders, or do we need to fund them a little bit more, or do we have to change anything, or do we have already now what's needed to fix that?
Two quick ones from me. I think the first one is one of the regulatory distortions of the U.S. being so hostile is that we saw a lot of offshore structures for crypto entities, with a foundation issuing tokens and various island nations in the Caribbean making a lot of revenue because of U.S. businesses organizing there. Yet to be seen, but I think there are a lot of really interesting regulatory developments around the United States that, combined with the federal tailwinds that we just described, will have more simple organization for token issuing and crypto businesses within this country, which is, I think, great news. We're running out of time, so I'm going to ask a quick final question. The crowd listening to us might think that everything's great, but I think, Mark, you described that we have a limited time to secure our gains here. What should people who are interested in making sure that crypto policy does not shift with the political winds be thinking about doing right now? To the whole panel, but go ahead, Mark.
I think of the significant emphasis that the industry was focusing on in terms of interfacing with government positions, government candidates, supporting candidates based on their positions vis-a-vis the industry. And we shouldn't be taking our foot off the gas on that. We saw the impact of that in the last go-round, and we may have a tendency to get complacent and think, oh, that'll never go away. It could very easily go away. So I think keep the foot on the gas of the grassroots advocacy, the grassroots positioning with the government, with the candidates, because that's the only way to keep things on our side.
Yeah, and I guess looking at Congress, the Genius Act passed with 78 Democratic votes and almost every, I think, Republican vote, and that was a great show of bipartisanship, but 78 is a lot less than the roughly 200 Democrats that are in the House right now. In Massachusetts, for instance, I think every senator and all but maybe 2 of the reps voted against the Genius Act, or would if it were to get there in the Senate. And the voice of individual voters, whether you're in the industry as a participant or not, makes a big difference there. And to the degree that you live in Massachusetts, which probably many of you do, communicating to your rep, specifically the Senate may be a lost cause, is a pretty meaningful thing to do.
Operate in good faith, don't be the bad guy, so that the regulators or the legislators have an easier job in passing favorable legislation.
Please join me in thanking our panel for their insights. And thank you to the Boston Dow and ETH Boston for having us here today. And thanks to all of you for being here. We appreciate it.